This is episode 42 of the Shame Proof Your Life podcast, the one where I talk about how to be a good mom. I'm your host and life coach, Danita Bremer. Have you ever received a prompting that you ignored for a long time, like 17 years? This podcast is that for me. I'm inviting you to meander through my memories with me because I believe when we tell our stories and truly listen to one another, we can change the world. Okay, so this morning I went on a walk. Took me about 45 minutes, and I was thinking about how we all search for meaning, like a meaningful life, to be a meaningful person, to make a difference, right? Those kinds of things. And I was thinking about what makes a meaningful life? What makes a person meaningful to us? What makes a place meaningful to us? What makes an object meaningful to us? And what I realized, and this is some dots that I've connected in my mind recently, is that for me at least, the answer is experience. I stepped back from thinking about what makes a life meaningful because that felt too big and abstract. And I thought, okay, what makes a thing meaningful to us? And I thought about something that was meaningful to me. And I thought about what makes it meaningful. And ultimately, I decided the thing that makes it meaningful is that I have experience with it. And I thought about this in terms of place, right? If you love to read like I do, place is an important part of stories. And I thought about places in my life that are meaningful to me that may not be meaningful to other people. So the first place I thought of was the piece of property that my parents bought that had no running water, no electricity, that I spent almost 5 years of my life living on. Now, 5 years, it's actually not that much. The first 5 years of my life, we lived in San Diego, and then we moved to Washington State where my grandparents had retired, and we lived on their property for a couple of years. And then we moved to this piece of property. And then because there was no running water, my mom decided to move to town and we lived in an apartment. So there was a bit of change with place in my life, but that property, we'll just call it the Mount Hull property, seems to be a place that is meaningful to me. And I think it's both because it was ours, like my parents owned it. So it wasn't that we were, squatting on my grandparents' property, or the apartment we lived in didn't belong to us. We couldn't like paint the walls and change things, but this property was ours. It was not really mine, but my parents. And so there was some ownership there. And also because I have so much experience with it. It's probably the period of time in my life that I remember the most. After living at this Mount Hall property, I was so absorbed in high school and getting to college that place wasn't really a thing that I was giving energy to. But in this period of time from about 9 to 14 years old, place was really special. I wasn't yet kind of spending tons of time off with my friends or focused on other endeavors. I spent a lot of time walking the property, exploring the property, taking pictures from the property, riding my bike, like just being on the property, having experience with it. And so that's kind of how I came to this realization that what makes a thing or a place or a person meaningful to us individually is experience. And then that word, I've been also pondering that word. And so that's why I say there are these two dots that were kind of connected in my mind, because I've been thinking about experience. I've been thinking about how we learn in the temple that Eve says it is better for us to pass through sorrow, that we may learn by our own experience how to distinguish good from evil. And this is why agency is such a core part of the gospel, a core part of our lives. Even if you're not religious and you don't believe in God, like agency is always a core principle for people. Freedom is sometimes how it shows up. So I kind of applied this to how do we live a meaningful life or be a meaningful person if experience is what makes something meaningful? And what I kind of came to was that's not really up to me. The meaningfulness of my life, of me as a person, I can put some meaning on that for myself. But what I'm always sort of searching for is like, how do I make it meaningful for other people? How do I make a difference? How do I, do something good in the world? And I just realized that I was kind of chasing this idea of what other people think is what makes me or my life meaningful. And I really felt this in my motherhood. It's probably one of my core desires is to be a good mom. It's one of the most meaningful parts of my life, one of the parts of my life that feels the most important. Like I have marriage, I have parenting, I have my own self-discovery, I have my business, I have my calling and my spirituality. Those are sort of the core parts of my life, the way I view them. And parenting always seems to be the hardest. And I think it's because I've been chasing this idea of I need to be a good mom. I need to make my motherhood, my parenting meaningful in some way. And that I've been telling myself that that depends on what other people think of me. And really, what I realized today, and what I want to share with you is that I get to make my own meaning. And yes, also there's this element of what my children think or don't think, or, possibly what other people think, but that's like so much less of it. And I think this is where we start sort of chasing our tails is when we think it's up to somebody else's objective opinion or subjective opinion, then we can't possibly know what we should do or what we shouldn't do or how to do things because we're putting it outside of us, right? And so as I was thinking about this, I thought about if I could like capsule or conceptualize or put this into like a I don't know a like a an equation of sorts. What would I put in there? What, based off of my experience, would I say makes you a good mom? And that's what this episode is about today. I know that was a really long intro, but it's all so good. And really, what I came up with is the most important thing is to decide what a good mom, quote unquote, good mom means to you. For some people, being a good mom is going to mean, providing financially for their families. Maybe they're the only provider and that's where they're at. That means that they're a good mom. I go to work, I make money, I put food on the table, I have a house, a roof over my kids' heads. That might mean a good mom. And for other people, that might not be on the radar at all. Right. And so I think it's so important for each of us individually to figure out what does it mean to me to be a good mom? And I'm going to kind of relate this back to this idea of experience. And I would encourage you to sit down and think about what is a good mom based off of my experience? What have I experienced that I think is a good mom? And another thing you can think about is what is not a good mom? What have I experienced that to me says not a good mom? Because you can learn sometimes even more from those experiences, the ones that are like, that's definitely not being a good mom, than you can from the ones where you say that is being a good mom. Sometimes the ones where we say, oh, that right there is being a good mom, they're a little harder to find, right? Possibly because our brains are wired to scan for all the things that go wrong. And so we don't often remember the moments when we're like, oh, I was a good mom today, or that moment right there was me being a good mom. So I like to just every once in a while, I've done this exercise a few times, but I like to just sit down and go, what is being a good mom to me? And here's what I came up for me. So, part of the brilliance of this is that you are going to have your own answers, and your answers will be different than my answers. They might be similar, especially if we have both been in similar cultures. We might have both learned and want to keep certain ideas of what it means to be a good mom. For me, it means to love my kids and to teach them. I'm going to talk about this teaching one first. I can find more moments as I reflect on my motherhood where I felt like I was a good mom because I was teaching in some way. And I use this term teach very broadly. For me, it's like teaching, but also exploring or discovering things together. And I was gifted. This wasn't on my radar, but I homeschooled my kids for 5 years. And I think it was an experience that I needed, that Heavenly Father knew I needed to help me realize that this is so much of who I am, teaching, and that I enjoy myself and I enjoy being a mother more when I am teaching. Now, that doesn't mean I'm always trying to teach. It just means that I know that this is kind of a part of me that I personally like and enjoy. And I had this gift of being my children's primary teacher, school teacher for a period of time. I had this experience with my daughter. I can't remember if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, where her and I were reading through a book. And by the way, reading to my children is something that I consciously have chosen. To me, that is an action that makes me feel like I am a good mom. I don't do it as much anymore because I've got a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they don't much want to sit down and be like, hey, mom, read me this story. Sometimes I can bend their arms a little bit and get them to sit with me and let me read to them. But I had this experience when my oldest daughter was, I think she was in third grade. So she was 8 or 9 years old. We had been reading through a book, and then there were these exercises, these questions, and different activities that went along with the book. And the whole book was like an allegory for Christ. And when she realized this, and we were talking about it, and how is the main character like Christ and things like that, I don't specifically remember the storyline of the book. Very vaguely, I do. But I just remember this experience I had with my oldest. We were sitting at our formal dining room table, which for a long time was our homeschool room. And we were talking about this story. And I just remember this moment where she looked up at me and I could see tears in her eyes. And she was like, Mommy, Jesus Christ didn't have to die for us. And I was kind of surprised. And I said, yeah, you're right. He didn't have to, but he chose to. And I could just see kind of her feeling the spirit. And it was such a sweet, tender moment where me teaching her put us in the right mindset and in the right place for her to have that moment and for me to experience it with her. It was beautiful. The other thing I think about is how our family chose to live in Europe for a year. This was from October 2016 to October 2017. We thought it was going to be perhaps longer than a year, but we knew it would be a year minimum. And it ended up being just 1 year. And we intentionally decided during that year in Europe to travel as much as we could. My husband was still working, so he was still, we had to be mindful of his schedule. And we lived in Germany where you can't homeschool, it's illegal. And so we had to be mindful of the school schedules. But as much as we could, every break our kids had from school, sometimes we took long weekends. We traveled to new places throughout Europe. Mostly we stayed to some bigger city areas because they're easier to get to. And this was sort of our first experience with Europe. And I just really enjoyed visiting places, looking, like pointing things out to my kids. Oh, look at that. Isn't that interesting? Going to museums, having different experiences, and talking with them about the experiences and asking them what they're learning and trying to engage them as much as I could get them to engage. So that for me is a really high value in my motherhood, is being engaged in my children's learning. And it's something I have to do consciously now. They go to school now, to a public school, and I have to consciously ask them, what are you learning? What's your favorite class? What's happening? What did you think about that? And I know it's not always easy. It's easier to just assume that everything is good and they're doing fine. And my kids also are very independent. They do their own homework. They keep track of everything on their own. I'm super grateful for this, but sometimes it means that I don't really know what they're learning and how they're engaging with it. Are they bored with it? Are they really enjoying it? And so I have to kind of insert myself when I find those moments. The other thing that is a really high value for me in defining what good motherhood is for me is I would I would place it under the umbrella of loving my children, but it falls under kind of two subcategories, which are caring for my children and supporting my children. And caring for them, I think of this as like physically and emotionally. I'm probably primed a little bit more toward the emotional care because of my early childhood experiences and feeling alone and abandoned and those kinds of things. And so I'm especially sensitive to that. But I don't want to make it seem like I'm perfect at it by any means, because to be honest, in many ways, I'm pretty absorbed in my own experiences. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it sometimes can lend itself to me not being aware of my kids' needs, physically and emotionally. I have a quick story that I'm super ashamed of, but the very first night I brought home my baby, my oldest baby, brand new parent. My oldest was born at 10:30 p.m. and we spent that night in the hospital, and then we spent one more night in the hospital because I had a little bit of a fever, and so they wouldn't discharge me. And the first night home, she wakes up in the middle of the night. And of course, I'm this brand new, groggy, tired, exhausted mother, right? And I nurse her and I'm sitting in bed with her. And I don't know, I fell asleep. And the next thing I know, I'm woken up by a crying baby who's on the floor. So, you guys, I dropped my newborn baby on the floor the first night she was home. How ashamed I felt, how utterly awful and terrible. And like, oh, I felt very bad about that. But I turned the light on. I checked her over. She didn't seem to have any scratches or bruises or nothing. And I mean, I kept tabs on it for a few days. And I think the angels just gently helped her reach the ground. And it was kind of a rude awakening to parenthood, right? Like, oh, I need to do better at taking care of myself and taking care of my baby. And I'm going to make mistakes, right? That was sort of the first slap in the face for me. I also had an experience with my second, who used to have terrible, terrible growing pains. And before I learned of Deep Blue by doTERRA, we would try to give her Tylenol or like heating pads. And one night she was having growing pains. She was probably like 2 or 3 years old. And we put a heating pad on her leg, and that always made her feel better. And I was supposed to go back into her room in about 15 minutes and turn the heating pad off. And I either fell asleep or just completely forgot. And the next morning, or I don't remember, it might have been in the middle of the night, I woke up and remembered she had this blister on her, kind of behind her knee from getting burned from the heating pad. And I felt so awful, like, oh, so awful. And I think the reason why I felt so awful was because I do have this value of taking care of my children. And these experiences were in stark contrast to what I felt like was doing a good job of taking care of my children. More recently, that same child, my second daughter, like I said, my kids are very independent. They can take care of themselves. My kids, I don't make breakfast or lunch for them, mostly because they don't want it, but also because they're more than capable of making it for themselves. And my daughter came to me and she said, Mom, I know I can make lunch for myself. I can make myself food, but sometimes I just want you to do it. And it was such like a poignant, like wise moment coming from her, this teenager. And I thought, yeah, I can relate to that. I feel that way too. I know I can do things for myself, but sometimes I just want somebody else to do it because it feels like care, right? And so now I think about that. It echoes in my mind pretty often. And I will offer, like, hey, do you want me to make you a grilled cheese sandwich? Do you want me to throw something in the oven for you? We have like taquitos and things like that. Do you want me to fix a salad? Things that if in that moment I feel capable of doing it, it's not too much, problem or hassle for me. Sometimes I'll just do that because it feels like care, right? And then the other part of this is like supporting my kids. This is a little bit different to me than caring for them. And I think it's because when I think about caring for my kids, it's like I'm taking charge and I'm like that same daughter. She one time on her way to school, when she went to our neighborhood school here, we were walking to school and she sprained her ankle. And so I like piggybacked her back to the house. We weren't too far away from the house and got her set up on the couch with an ice pack and all of that. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. How are you? What can I get you? Right. And like, I really try to care in those moments. And I think it comes from last week's episode, who was there when you got hurt. I so often felt alone when I was hurt or sick. And so I think that's a sensitive point for me in my motherhood. And I want my kids to feel like I'm there for them when they are hurt or not well in some way. But sometimes supporting them means letting them lead. Very often, my kids will come home from school and they'll complain about something. They'll complain about a teacher or other kids in the class or something like that, an assignment maybe. And, it's normal. I let them vent and complain. And then I will say, do you want me to talk to the teacher? Do you want me to do something about it? And so very rarely do they say, yes, I want you to talk to the teacher. But most of the time they say, no, it's fine. I'll deal with it. I'll ask my kids, how can I help? Right? Because sometimes I know they don't necessarily want help. Maybe they're venting. Maybe they just want to complain for a moment. And it helps them see, like, do I really want help with this? And sometimes they have ways I can help, and sometimes they don't. One of the ways, because of the blessings that Heavenly Father has given to our family, is supporting them by paying for lessons and classes and experiences. I have a daughter who, at the moment, is aspiring to be a famous actress. And the way I can help her right now is paying for acting lessons, supporting her when she wants to be involved in the school play. So that's what I try to do. And one thing that I think is fabulous is that each of my kids needs different kinds of support. My oldest really needs me to be hands off and to not tell her what to do or what not to do. I will say things instead like, well, here are some options, or you might consider, or have you thought about, right? Because I really need to leave it open ended for her to do the exploration. She really needs to learn by her own experience, positive and negative. And this is something I've learned about her in the 17 years that I've been her mother, almost 18 years. And so I know this about her. My second, she wants to do everything and she wants to do everything at the highest level with excellence and perfection. I just recently realized that I am most like her. And it kind of surprised me because I don't like look at her and go, oh, that's how I was. That's how I was. But if I kind of step back and think more objectively, I'm like, oh, that is how I was. I was very strict with the standards I had for myself and wanted excellence and wanted things to be done the right way and on time and those kinds of things. And because she is like that, I have to really pull her back. I have to say, you need to make a choice. You can't do all of this. Sometimes we have to put things down or just do things at a lesser level. I would have hated that if somebody told me that, but that's probably the lesson that I'm still continuing to learn. You can't do everything. You have to constrain. You have to learn how to just choose what's most important, how to prioritize. And my son, he never wants to do anything. He I find things that would be amazing for him. In fact, baseball is like this. He loves baseball. He plays baseball. But at first, he was like, no, I don't want to play baseball. And I was like, come on, you would love it and you would be good at it. So I had to kind of push him into it. And then once he got into it, he's like, oh, yeah, this was good. I liked it. So that's for him, he's kind of opposite of his sister, of where he never wants to do anything. He doesn't want to have a lot of friends around. He doesn't want to have a lot of different experiences. He's fine kind of staying home. And I do look at him and see myself in him, but I have to like push him and force him. And I just say, like, you just have to try it for 1 year, or you just have to try it one time. And usually I know him well enough to know what would be really good and fun for him. And he usually gets on board once I give him that little push. So it's interesting to know my children intimately and know what they need from me. And sometimes I don't come to them individually. Sometimes I say, sorry, children, or for you, child, I know this is going to be hard for you because I have to make a decision that is good for everyone. And somebody is going to be upset. Sometimes I have to make the decision that's good for me. So that is, I think, the main part of being a good mom and having a meaningful experience in our motherhood is choosing or deciding on purpose what it means for us, what that like good motherhood means. And for everyone, it's going to be a different thing. I have a few more kind of tips that go along with this that I'm not going to elaborate as much on. But once you know what being a good mom means to you, then do it and do it your best. And you're totally going to fail and you're not going to be perfect at it, but just do it with the intention of doing your best and trying to follow through. My middle daughter plays piano, and for some reason, for the life of me, I cannot remember her piano lessons and picking her up. Like, she texts me at the end of her lesson so often, did you forget to pick me up? And I feel bad about this. So I've been trying to set intentions with, like, when she is at piano lessons, I need to set an alarm, or I need to be present, or I need to just stay there because it's important to me. I think it makes her feel not cared for when I forget her, which makes sense, right? And I am not perfect at this. I am often juggling a lot of things and I drop the ball. And so, part of this is leaning into the idea that you're not always going to be perfect and you're not always going to be able to meet all your kids' needs at the same time, at least if you have more than one or two kids like me. And part of this too, doing your best, is taking responsibility for your emotions. One of the very first lessons I learned when I came across life coaching was that my kids don't frustrate me. I frustrate me with my thoughts about my kids. And that is a difficult thing to do sometimes, is to not blame them for how you feel, right? That's part, I think, of doing your best as a mother. And then, when you don't do your best, when you fall short, when you make mistakes, make those repairs as needed. This is what repentance is all about, and it's hard to apologize to your kid when you feel like you're the adult and you should know better, and, those kinds of things. Or maybe some parents feel like, they don't need to apologize because because they know they are doing their best. But I think it goes so far when you go to your kid and say, hey, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry for picking you up late. Can I go get you an ice cream to make it up? Right. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I just give the verbal apology. So I think it's more important to understand that you're never going to be perfect. And it's more important to be honest and real in your imperfection than it is to try to be perfect. And then a couple more things is, and this may not be something that resonates with you, but I think it's important to be present. And it's just comes back to this idea that your kids don't necessarily need you to do anything. Of course, you're going to do plenty by default, but what they really need is you. That's what they really want. They want your attention. They want your presence, especially the younger they are. And for me, this is sort of a universal concept or, a universal rule that probably all of us can use to be more present. And then the last thing I would say is just to see your motherhood in the best possible light. It is so easy to beat ourselves up. It's way more difficult to give ourselves grace and love in those moments when we did fall short. And it's a practice. It's a practice to apologize and think, well, why did I forget my kid from piano? Oh, it's because I was trying to make dinner and then the other kid had homework and this and this and that, right? So what was behind that maybe, and these are just examples, is that I was trying to do a lot for a lot of people. It's not that I purposely forgot her. It's not that I don't care about her. It's that time of day, I'm just always trying to do more than I can actually handle. Right. And I can see how that comes from a very loving place. Right. So I can look at my motherhood as you're always late picking up your daughter from piano. You don't care about her, blah, blah, blah. Right. This kind of like critical, self-judgmental, or I can be like, look at how much you love all the people in your family. Right. And maybe you're trying to do a little too much. Can we scale back? Right. Do you see how that is like so much more loving and grace filled than judging yourself? Because here's the thing, when you see your motherhood in the best possible light, you are going to want to keep going. It is just naturally motivating. It helps your kids when you choose to evaluate what you have done or not done in the best possible light. That's the very thing that Jesus Christ does for us. Okay, that was a lot. That's enough for now, and so are you. If you want to hear more of my thoughts that aren't necessarily my stories, sign up for my heart-to-heart notes or follow me on Instagram at Danita Bremer Coaching. Links are in the show notes. Until next time, go be you and follow the Spirit.